Hey, let me see your hands. Get down on the ground. Get on the ground. Roll your hands. Roll on your stomach. Oh, my God. Stop resisting. Stop resisting. You're going to get tased. You're going to get tased and you'll stop. Give me a hand.
He had been a teacher for over 2 decades. Every morning, he walked into a school gymnasium and stood in front of children. Parents trusted him with their kids. The school system trusted him. The community trusted him. And for years, that trust was never questioned. But on one afternoon in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Stephen Phillips, 51 years old veteran, physical education teacher, drove to a house he had never been to before. He had directions. He had a plan. And waiting for him inside were not the people he expected. This is the story of the sting operation that stopped something terrible before it could begin. It is the story of how investigators built a trap out of patients' digital evidence and careful coordination. It is the story of a man who used the internet to hunt and how the internet became the thing that caught him. And it raises a question that every community needs to sit with. How well do we really know the people we trust with our children? Albuquerque is a city of wide skies and long roads. It sits in the high desert of New Mexico where the Rio Grande cuts through the valley and the Sandia Mountains rise in the east like a wall of stone. It is a city of roughly 600,000 people, a place where neighborhoods range from quiet suburban streets to dense urban corridors. It is also a city where the Albuquerque Police Department maintains a specialized unit dedicated to one purpose: finding people who prey on children. These investigators do not wait for crimes to happen. They create the opportunity for a crime to happen, and then they watch to see who walks through the door. The tactic is called a sting operation. Law enforcement creates a fictitious scenario, typically online, designed to attract individuals who are actively seeking to exploit minors. An undercover officer takes on a false identity. A conversation begins. And from that conversation, the truth of a person's intentions reveals itself word by word, message by message. This particular operation began the way most of them do. Online, someone reached out. The message seemed ordinary at first, but it quickly became something else entirely. On the other side of the screen, an Albuquerque detective was playing a role. He was posing as a father who had a 12-year-old daughter. And the man who sent that first message was Stephen Phillips. He was 51 years old. He had a career, a reputation, and a position of authority in the lives of young people. He also had a habit of going online and looking for something that no grown man should ever be looking for. On this particular day, he found what he thought was an opportunity. He had no idea he had just walked into the center of a trap. It did not start with something obvious. It rarely does. In online predator investigations, detectives are trained to recognize patterns. They know that individuals who target children do not typically announce their intentions immediately. They move slowly. They test. They probe for reactions. They use language designed to seem innocent on the surface while carrying darker meaning underneath. What matters legally and what investigators focus on is not what the suspect implies. It is what the suspect explicitly says and explicitly agrees to. The conversation between Stephen Phillips and the undercover detective developed over a period of time through an online messaging platform. The detective, posing as a father, engaged with Phillips in a way that was deliberate and controlled. He allowed Phillips to guide the direction of the conversation. He did not entrap Phillips by initiating sexual topics. He waited. He responded. He documented every word. And Phillips provided those words himself. As the conversation progressed, Phillips began expressing interest in the man's daughter. Not casual interest, not parental or professional interest, the kind of interest that no adult should ever express about a 12-year-old child. He began discussing meeting up. He began discussing what that meeting would involve. The detective, still in character as the father continued to engage. He asked questions. He maintained the scenario. He gave Phillips every opportunity to back away, to change the subject, to say he had been joking. Phillips did not back away. He doubled down. He provided details. He expressed enthusiasm. He made clear that his intentions were not ambiguous. At some point in a conversation like this, there is a line that separates curiosity from criminal intent. Stephen Phillips crossed that line. And when he crossed it, the investigators on the other side of that screen began the next phase of the operation. They arranged a meeting, a specific house, a specific time, a specific address. Phillips agreed without hesitation. He confirmed the appointment, and then he started driving. The house was ordinary. From the outside, there was nothing unusual about it. A residential street in Albuquerque, afternoon light, quiet. Inside, law enforcement officers were positioned and waiting. Body cameras were rolling. Recording equipment was active. The chain of evidence was being maintained in real time. When Stephen Phillips pulled up to that address, he was alone in his vehicle. He had navigated to the location. He had found the house. He got out of the car. He walked toward the front door, and that is when everything happened at once. Albuquerque Police Department officers emerged. Commands were given loudly and clearly. The entire arrest was captured on body camera footage, every second of it, from the moment Phillips crossed the threshold of the property to the moment he was placed in handcuffs. Phillips did not run. There was nowhere to run. He did not fight. The officers were already on him before he had time to process what was happening. Within seconds, Stephen Phillips, gym teacher, 20-plus-year veteran of working with children, was in custody. His hands were cuffed behind his back. The house he had driven to for the purposes he had agreed to online was not what he thought it was. There was no father. There was no daughter. There was only law enforcement. And there was the evidence of everything he had said and everything he had done to get himself to that front door. The arrest itself lasted less than a minute, but the consequences of that minute would reshape the rest of Stephen Phillips' life. What happened next in the interrogation room revealed something even more unsettling than the arrest itself. Once a suspect is taken into custody in an operation like this, the process moves quickly. Phillips was transported. The officers involved in the arrest documented everything. Body camera footage was reviewed. The digital evidence, the complete record of the online conversation, was preserved. Chain of custody protocols were followed precisely. This is not television. In real investigations, the hours after an arrest involve a tremendous amount of paperwork, protocol, and preparation. Every piece of evidence has to be handled correctly because defense attorneys will look for any procedural error, any gap in documentation, any moment where the collection of evidence deviated from the established rules. The investigators who ran this sting operation were experienced. They had done this before. They knew that the arrest was only the beginning. What mattered now is what happened in the room where Stephen Phillips would be asked to explain himself. Phillips was processed. He was photographed. He was advised of his rights. And then he sat down across from a detective. Outside that room, his life as he had known it was already in free fall. The school where he worked would eventually learn what had happened to one of its teachers. Parents who had sent their children to his class, parents who had shaken his hand at school events, who had trusted him to push their kids through fitness drills and teach them the rules of basketball and volleyball, would eventually see the news. His name would eventually become public. But Stephen Phillips did not know any of that yet. In that room, he still believed he had a way out. He believed he could talk his way through this. He was wrong. The interrogation room is a controlled environment. Everything about it is deliberate. The lighting, the seating arrangement, the temperature, the way the detective enters and sits down. Even the silence, the pauses, the moments when nothing is said are tools. Experienced interrogators know that most people, when placed in that room, feel an overwhelming need to fill the silence, to explain, to justify, to rationalize. And rationalization is often the most revealing thing a suspect can do. When the detective sat down across from Stephen Phillips, the body camera was still rolling. Phillips had already been advised of his rights. He had chosen to speak. That choice would cost him significantly. The detective began methodically. He introduced the situation calmly. He acknowledged that Phillips was in a difficult position. He did not yell. He did not accuse. He used the tone of someone who simply wanted to understand what had happened, who had all the time in the world and was genuinely curious about how a 51-year-old gym teacher ended up in that house on that afternoon. Phillips responded. He started talking, and almost immediately the shape of his defense became visible. He did not deny being in the conversation. He could not deny it. The messages existed. They were time-stamped. They were linked to his accounts. Instead, Phillips began constructing a different kind of argument. He suggested that he had not really meant what he said. He suggested that he had been curious about how these operations worked. He suggested, with remarkable composure for a man sitting in a police interrogation chair, that he had come to the house not to do what he had agreed to do, but to see if the situation was real. He framed himself as an investigator of sorts, as someone who was testing the scenario, as someone who had never truly intended to follow through. The detective listened. He nodded at appropriate moments, and then he began very carefully to dismantle each piece of that story. There is a particular kind of deflection that investigators encounter frequently in cases like this. It has been studied extensively in criminology and psychology. When confronted with undeniable digital evidence of predatory communication, some suspects do not deny the words. Instead, they reframe the intent behind the words. They introduce ambiguity where none actually existed. They use language that sounds reasonable, words like curious, testing, exploring, to suggest that a darker purpose was never truly present. Stephen Phillips employed this strategy consistently throughout his interrogation. He told the detective that he had engaged in the online conversation out of curiosity. He said he wanted to understand how sting operations worked. He said that when he agreed to meet, when he confirmed the address, confirmed the time, drove across Albuquerque to a specific residential location, he was not going there with harmful intent. He was going there, he claimed, to see if it was real. The detective probed this explanation carefully. He asked Phillips why, if he was simply curious, he had not contacted law enforcement directly to ask about sting operations. Why he had not used other legitimate means to satisfy that curiosity. Why his messages had contained explicit expressions of intent rather than the cautious exploratory language of someone who was merely curious. Phillips did not have clean answers to these questions. He pivoted. He added new layers to the story. He introduced the idea that he had been going through a difficult time personally. He used language that suggested vulnerability, that suggested confusion, that suggested he was not quite himself. Throughout all of this, the detective did not raise his voice. He simply kept asking questions. And the answers, the contradictions, the evasions, the moments when Phillips's composure cracked and he had to reset were all recorded. Every word, every shift in body language, every pause. What Phillips chose not to say was as important as what he said. He never offered a genuine explanation for why a man with no investigative role and no law enforcement connection would conduct his own private test of a sting operation by driving to an address he had agreed to visit for explicitly stated harmful purposes. He never adequately explained the specificity of his messages. He never explained why a curious person would need to arrive at a location rather than simply stop communicating once his curiosity was satisfied. The story he told did not hold together, and the detective knew it. The case was already building itself around the evidence that already existed. The interrogation was adding to that evidence in ways Phillips did not seem to fully grasp. The investigation outside that room was simultaneously piecing together everything else that would eventually be used against him. Sting operations do not rest entirely on what happens in the interrogation room. By the time a suspect sits down across from a detective, the core of the case is often already assembled. The digital evidence in a case like this is extensive. Every message sent through an online platform generates metadata, timestamps, IP addresses, device identifiers, account registration information. The chain of digital communication between Stephen Phillips and the undercover detective was not a handful of vague exchanges. It was a documented record of escalating specific explicit communication that established intent beyond any reasonable ambiguity. Investigators working cases of this nature are trained in digital forensics. They know how to preserve evidence from online platforms in ways that are legally admissible. They know how to document the progression of a conversation, not just the most egregious moments, but the entire arc, showing how one message led to the next, how Phillips guided the conversation in specific directions, how he confirmed and reconfirmed his intentions at multiple points. The drive to the house was itself a piece of evidence. Phillips had not stumbled upon the address. He had received it. He had confirmed the appointment. He had navigated to the location. His physical presence at that specific address at that specific time was consistent with one thing and one thing only: the intent he had expressed in the messages that preceded the meeting. Defense attorneys in cases like this often challenge the sting operation itself. They argue entrapment. Entrapment, in legal terms, is a specific concept. It does not mean that law enforcement created an opportunity for a crime. It means that law enforcement induced someone to commit a crime they would not otherwise have committed. The distinction is critical. In order for an entrapment defense to succeed, a defendant must demonstrate that they were not predisposed to commit the offense, that the government essentially created the criminal intent in someone who had no prior inclination toward it. In the case of Stephen Phillips, the evidence of predisposition was embedded in the content of his own messages. He had initiated and maintained the conversation. He had directed its progression. He had confirmed the meeting multiple times. He had arrived. The investigation also looked beyond the single conversation in the single arrest. When someone is caught in a sting of this nature, investigators routinely examine whether the individual has engaged in similar behavior previously, whether there are other online accounts, other conversations, other potential victims who never came forward or never knew they were in danger. That examination was part of the larger investigation into Phillips. It added depth to the picture of who Stephen Phillips was, not just on the day he was arrested, but in the period leading up to it. The evidence taken in its entirety told a story that was difficult to walk away from. Phillips was charged, and the process of accountability moved forward. Stephen Phillips faced serious criminal charges arising from the sting operation. The primary charge was attempted criminal sexual contact of a minor, a charge that reflects the law's recognition that the crime does not require the actual presence of a victim to be prosecutable. The agreement, the intent, and the actions taken in furtherance of that intent, driving to the location, were sufficient under New Mexico law to constitute an attempt. He also faced charges related to the solicitation of a minor through electronic communications. These charges carry significant sentencing ranges under New Mexico statutes. Crimes involving the attempted exploitation of minors, particularly those involving children as young as 12, are treated with maximum seriousness by prosecutors. The youth of the intended victim is an aggravating factor. The use of electronic communication to facilitate the offense is an aggravating factor. The defendant's position of trust and authority in the lives of children is considered in the broader context of the case, even when it is not explicitly an element of the charge. Phillips's career as a physical education teacher, a career built entirely on his proximity to children, on parents' faith that he was a safe and responsible adult in their children's lives, became a painful backdrop to every aspect of the legal proceedings. The school district was notified. Phillips was removed from his position. His teaching license came under review. The professional world he had inhabited for decades, the gymnasium, the school hallways, the after-school sports programs, the parent-teacher nights closed itself off from him entirely. The legal proceedings moved through the New Mexico court system. At each stage, the digital evidence formed the backbone of the case against him. The body camera footage from the arrest documented the moment of his capture. The interrogation footage documented the inadequacy of his explanations. And the messages themselves, the record of what Stephen Phillips had written unprompted to what he believed was the father of a 12-year-old girl, documented his intent in his own words, in his own voice, with his own timestamps. Justice in cases like this is not swift. The process is slow and deliberate, but it moves. And the outcome for Stephen Phillips reflected the severity of what he had set out to do on the day he drove to that house. Interrogation footage in cases of this nature is rarely comfortable to watch. It is also rarely simple. When we observe Stephen Phillips in that room, watching his body language shift, listening to the progression of his explanations, noticing the moments when his composure holds and the moments when it doesn't, we are watching something that psychologists and criminologists have studied carefully. The curiosity defense is not unique to Phillips. It appears with striking regularity in interrogations of individuals caught in online predator sting operations. Researchers who study the psychology of online predatory behavior have noted that this kind of rationalization often reflects a phenomenon called cognitive distortion. In this context, cognitive distortion refers to a pattern of thinking in which an individual reframes their behavior in ways that minimize harm, justify intent, or redirect responsibility. The person genuinely believes or convinces themselves to believe that their actions are less serious than they are, that they meant no real harm, that they would have stopped at some point, that circumstances rather than character explain what they did. The challenge with cognitive distortion is that it can be performed convincingly. Phillips, sitting in that interrogation room, appeared calm and articulate for long stretches of the interview. He used measured language. He engaged with the detective's questions rather than refusing to answer them. On the surface, he appeared to be cooperating, to be a reasonable man caught in an unfortunate misunderstanding. But detectives trained in behavioral analysis are specifically equipped to look past the surface. They listen for internal inconsistencies. They note when a suspect's emotional register does not match the gravity of the situation. They pay attention to the progression of the story, how it shifts and expands and adds new details when a previous version fails to satisfy. In Phillips's case, several of these markers were present. His affect, the emotional tone of his responses, was notably controlled for someone in the position he was in. This is not automatically indicative of guilt. People respond to high-stress situations in different ways. But when considered alongside the content of his messages, the specificity of his planning, and the fact that he drove to the address rather than disengaging at any point, The controlled presentation in the interrogation room added another layer to the picture. There is also the question of grooming behavior in a broader sense. Experts in child protection and predatory psychology have consistently noted that individuals who abuse positions of trust, teachers, coaches, clergy, counselors, often develop a parallel public persona that is deliberately constructed to be beyond reproach. This persona serves a functional purpose. It creates social insulation. It makes accusations harder to believe. It ensures that the community responds to an arrest not with immediate acceptance but with shock and denial. Not him, he was such a good teacher. He was always great with the kids. I never would have believed it. These reactions, painful as they are part of the pattern. They are not evidence that the person is innocent. They are evidence of how effectively a double life can be maintained. What the interrogation of Stephen Phillips ultimately reveals is not a man who made a single impulsive mistake in a moment of weakness. The digital record shows planning. The multiple confirmations of the meeting show deliberation. The drive across the city shows commitment. And the curiosity explanation constructed and articulated in real time under pressure shows a mind that even in the moment of being caught was still working to protect itself from the full weight of accountability. That is not curiosity. That is something else entirely. In this case, there was no victim in the traditional sense. The 12-year-old girl in the conversation was not real. She was a fictional construct created by law enforcement to identify and stop someone who was actively seeking to harm a child. The operation succeeded. The harm was prevented. But preventing harm is not the same as saying that harm was not attempted. And it is worth pausing here, pausing in the way that good documentary storytelling requires to think carefully about the child who was not there. Because somewhere in Albuquerque and in every city in America, there are 12-year-old girls who are real. They go to school, they have gym class, they trust their teachers. They do not fully understand the landscape of danger that exists in the digital world. They do not know that the platforms they use for entertainment and social connection are the same platforms that predatory adults use to find them. They do not know how to recognize the early signs of grooming, the escalating personal questions, the suggestions of special treatment, the slow erosion of appropriate boundaries that happens so gradually it does not feel like anything sinister until it is already far along. They trust because trust is natural for a child. They trust their teachers, especially adults selected by institutions vetted by background checks, given authority over the physical and developmental well-being of young people. The child who was never in that house deserves to be thought about. She deserves to be the reason we tell this story, not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of the internet in the abstract, but as a specific concrete reminder that the people who prey on children are not strangers in the obvious sense. They are coaches, they are tutors, they are neighbors, they are teachers with 20 years of experience, in a room full of trophies, and a reputation that no parent would ever think to question. The sting operation that caught Stephen Phillips was not just a law enforcement success. It was a moment of protection for every child who was never in that house. For every 12-year-old who woke up that morning and went to school and came home safe and never knew that somewhere across the city, someone had been planning to hurt someone exactly like her. That child is the reason this work is done. That child is the reason this story needs to be told. Every time a sting operation like this results in an arrest, the public response follows a familiar pattern. There is shock. There is disbelief. There are people who knew the suspect who refuse to accept the evidence. And then gradually, as the evidence becomes undeniable, there is a reckoning, a collective uncomfortable process of reassessing what we thought we knew about a person and about our own community. That reckoning is valuable. It is uncomfortable, but it is necessary. The case of Stephen Phillips is not an isolated incident. Law enforcement agencies across the United States conduct sting operations of this nature regularly, and they produce arrests regularly. The Albuquerque Police Department alone has run multiple operations targeting online predators in the years preceding and following the Phillips case. The pattern is consistent. The targets come from all walks of life, all ages, all professional backgrounds, all income levels. There is no reliable demographic profile of a predator that allows us to look at a person and confidently say that person is not a threat. What the research does tell us is that predators frequently gravitate toward positions that provide legitimate, socially sanctioned access to children. Education is one of those fields. Coaching is one of those fields. Youth ministry, tutoring, childcare mentorship programs. These are all fields that provide cover for individuals who are motivated to find proximity to children. Most people who work in these fields are exactly what they appear to be, dedicated, caring professionals who have chosen their work out of genuine commitment to young people. But the existence of that majority does not eliminate the minority. The existence of trust does not eliminate the risk. What the Phillips case tells us practically is this. First, trust is not the same as verification. Trusting someone because they have worked in a school for 20 years is not the same as knowing that person is safe. Background checks have limits. Professional credentials have limits. Community reputation has limits. The only thing that has no limit is the willingness to remain vigilant and to take warning signs seriously, especially when the person displaying those signs is someone we thought we knew. Second, the internet does not lie, but it does conceal. The conversations that Stephen Phillips had online were invisible to the people in his professional life. They were invisible to his colleagues. They were invisible to parents. They existed in a private digital space that felt to Phillips like a space without consequences. He was wrong. But the instinct that led him to believe he was operating without scrutiny is the same instinct that makes this kind of behavior so dangerous and so persistent. Children who are targeted online are targeted in that same space of perceived privacy. Teaching children about digital safety is not a one-time conversation. It is an ongoing process that needs to evolve as the platforms evolve. Third, sting operations work. They are controversial in some quarters, and they are not without their procedural and ethical complexities. But the evidence from cases like this is clear. By creating the opportunity for a predator to act on their intentions and then catching them in the act, law enforcement is preventing real harm to real children. The argument that someone might not have followed through is precisely the kind of argument that Phillips himself made in the interrogation room. The digital record and his willingness to drive across a city to an unknown address are a compelling answer to that argument. Fourth, when institutions discover that someone in a position of trust has engaged in this kind of behavior, the institution's response matters. Swift removal, full cooperation with law enforcement, and transparent communication with the community are not just procedurally correct responses, they are morally necessary ones. The school district's response in the Phillips case is worth examining as a model for how institutions should handle these situations, not as a judgment on any specific administrator's choices, but as a reminder that protecting children requires institutional courage as well as individual vigilance. The broader social lesson of this case is not that we should distrust every teacher or every coach. It is that we should understand that trust, however reasonable, requires a foundation of ongoing accountability. And that accountability cannot rest entirely on institutions. It requires all of us. Stephen Phillips drove to a house on an ordinary afternoon in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He had made his decision. He had made it over the course of many messages on many occasions across a digital conversation that left no room for misinterpretation. He had confirmed it, reconfirmed it, and then physically acted on it. He drove through the streets of his own city, the city where he worked, where he was known, where he had spent decades standing in front of children with the full trust of their parents. And he drove to that address with a purpose that he would spend the next several hours of his life trying to explain away. The officers waiting for him did not allow the explanation to become the story. The evidence did not allow the explanation to become the story. What became the story instead was the arrest, the interrogation, the case, the accountability, and the quiet, crucial truth at the center of all of it, that the 12-year-old girl he thought he was going to meet was never there. And because she was never there, something that could have been devastating never became real. That matters. That is worth saying out loud. The people who run operations like this, the detectives who spend hours in character building false personas and maintaining the psychological endurance required to sit across from someone like Stephen Phillips and ask questions with a steady voice, they are doing something that is unglamorous and often invisible. They do not stop crimes that have already happened. They stop crimes that are about to happen. They stand between the predator and the child in the digital space where that confrontation is quietly taking place, and they pull the predator into the light. That work is necessary. That work saves lives. Before we close, there is one question worth leaving with. Stephen Phillips spent more than 20 years in a career defined by access to children. Every year of those 20 years, there were children in his gymnasium. Parents who dropped them off. Parents who picked them up. Parents who never thought to wonder. We do not know the full scope of who Stephen Phillips was before the day he was arrested. The investigation looked for answers. But some questions in cases like this do not get complete answers. And that incompleteness, that uncertainty about what came before the day the camera started rolling, is part of what makes this case so difficult to sit with. To every parent watching this, your instincts matter. Your questions matter. The conversation you have with your child tonight about who they talk to online and what they should do, if that conversation ever makes them uncomfortable, matters more than you may realize. And to every educator, every coach, every person in a position of trust with children, the trust that has been extended to you is not a right. It is something given in good faith by people who are choosing to believe in you. Protect it. If you are struggling with something you cannot explain with impulses you know are wrong, there are resources, there are hotlines, there are ways to get help before a decision gets made that cannot be undone. The door to accountability does not only swing one way. And for those who are willing to walk through it before harm is done, there is still a different kind of story to tell. Stephen Phillips did not walk through that door. He drove to a different one, and when it opened, it was not what he expected.